From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and host of Post Reports' weekly politics roundtable. It's Friday, January 31st. I'm joined this week by the Post White House economics reporter, Jeff Stein. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we're also here with congressional reporter Liz Goodwin. Hey, Liz.
Hello.
So this week, we're starting to see some familiar chaos from the new Trump administration as it seeks to follow through with his campaign promises and upend longstanding norms along the way. So today, we're going to dig into three really important stories. One is the political fallout following the tragic plane crash this week in Washington, D.C. The second is the confusion and backlash caused by the Trump administration's call to freeze and then unfreeze all federal grants. And finally, the Senate confirmation hearings of three controversial nominees, Kash Patel for FBI director, Tulsi Gabbard for director of national intelligence, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services secretary. All three testified, and there is a lot to unpack. So guys, let's start with that horrific accident Wednesday night. To recap, a military helicopter and a commercial airplane that was about to land at Ronald Reagan National Airport crashed and fell into the Potomac River. There were no survivors. During appearances on Thursday, President Trump quickly blamed Democrats and diversity, equity, and inclusion policies for the accident, even though he provided no evidence and admitted that he didn't actually have any.
My administration will set the highest possible bar for aviation safety. We have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. It matters intellect, talent, the word talent. They have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. You can't have regular people doing that job. They won't be able to do it. But we'll restore faith in American air travel. I'll have more to say about that. I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office. And here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing.
So guys, I first want to note that later on Thursday, our colleague Glenn Kessler did some reporting on this and actually found that a program that sought to promote people with the types of conditions that Trump mentioned was actually launched in 2019 under the Trump administration. We've also seen a preliminary report from the Federal Aviation Administration that points to short staffing at the time of the accident. It said that 2 controllers were actually doing the job of 4 when this accident occurred. Liz, can you just talk about the argument that Trump is making here and how it squares with what we know?
Yeah, so I think this DEI message has just been like on Trump's mind a lot. It was a huge core piece of like what he would say on the campaign trail. It's part of this wanting to like ferret DEI out of the federal government. It's just not something anyone was talking about or thinks has anything to do with like the many very real problems with airline safety. And like there's been a lot of reporting about near misses and questions about, you know, what is causing this and the strains on the system. And this idea of it having anything to do with DEI is just not in that universe of concerns that people have. And the other thing is like, FAA aviation safety is one of the few like truly apolitical things that I think just everyone can agree on. We want airplanes to be safe. It's not really one of those fights on the Hill where people are like, let's not fund the FAA. Like that's just it's never one of these footballs that gets thrown around when people are trying to enact leverage on the other side or whatever. So it's just odd to see it thrown into like such a political debate. And there's a lot of Republicans who were backing him up because they'll back him up on anything, but it was not something that anyone really wanted to be talking about or going there on the Hill.
Yeah, and it's something that he really launched into very quickly after this disaster. You know, there will be investigations, surely, about this, but he decided pretty quickly that this thing, which he acknowledged he didn't have evidence for, was the cause. Jeff, I think this is a pretty familiar tale with Trump. You know, we've seen recently him politicize tragedies very quickly. That was the case after Hurricane Helene in the Southeast last year. It was the case after the terrorist attack in New Orleans on New Year's Day, where he quickly suggested that it had something to do with somebody crossing the border. That didn't turn out to actually be true. What does this just say broadly about Trump and his willingness to kind of go to these places so quickly?
He understands at some level, and I think people are like, why is he talking about DEI in the context of FAA regulations, as Liz is saying? But it's like he has this strategy that I think has, at a minimum, proved, successful enough to get him elected to the White House twice, where it's like the specific factual predicates are secondary to shifting the terrain of the debate onto favorable terms for him. So it's in the presidential election, what did Trump not want to talk about? He did not want to talk about abortion. He did not want to talk about healthcare. So you got a question on those topics. Trump is no, I'm just going to shift the entire framework of the discussion onto my terrain, which is immigration and wokeness and DEI and whatever, the issues that Republicans like to talk about. The reality is we're still talking about the set of policy issues that Trump wants us to be talking about.
Yeah, it's a dilemma for the media, because do you fact check these things and give them ammunition? Do you kind of legitimize the storyline by talking about these things? But these are also the words of the President of the United States, and you don't want to just let them go and not fact check them. It's something we dealt with a lot during the first Trump administration. I'm sure we're going to be dealing a lot with it during this one. Liz, before we move on to other topics, I just wanted to know, what should we expect from Congress or from others as far as actually getting to the bottom of what happened with this tragic accident?
I do think there's going to be action on the Hill on this. I think for the moment, everyone's sort of waiting for the NTSB investigation and sort of letting the agencies take the lead. But this is something that lawmakers care a lot about, not just general aviation safety, but DCA. Most of them fly out of there, in and out of there every single week. And
the closest airport to the Capitol and to Washington, D.C., yes.
Yes, and their lives are very dependent on if they can get a flight out of there. So one of the factors in all of this is that they keep adding more routes to DCA, in part to make lawmakers' lives easier, because it's, they want to be able to get back home as quickly as possible for the weekend and then come back. And there has been ongoing debate on the Hill about whether that airport is just too crowded and whether that's affecting safety. And the Virginia and Maryland delegations have been very fired up, saying that it is not safe. In part, that's because they also represent other airports, Dulles and BWI, that they would like to see more routes on. But I think they also have a point that it's a very busy airport for a very tiny strip of land. And I imagine we'll see that debate continue.
Yeah, and certainly we'll be waiting to hear more from that preliminary FAA review about understaffing at the airport when this accident occurred. I wanted to pivot over to something that Jeff has been doing a lot of great reporting on this week. I think I saw, Jeff, that you've written something like 10 stories this week. This is very much in your wheelhouse. And that's that on Monday, the Trump administration issued a directive that halted trillions of dollars in federal funding, basically all grants and loans that are dispersed by the federal government. Pretty immediately, it interrupted the flow of money to key programs like Medicaid, which provides health care to millions of low-income Americans. Then on Tuesday, we saw a federal judge temporarily halt this directive. On Wednesday, the Trump administration rescinded the directive. But in the middle was a whole lot of chaos. Jeff, you've been covering this all week, as I noted. Where do things actually stand with this right now?
So I guess the core thing that I think people need to take away from all this is that, I've been writing not just this week, but for a couple of years now about how senior Trump people and Trump himself have been very clear that they think that they should have way more unilateral authority over canceling spending. And this debate gets bogged down really easily in very boring terms like apportionment and impoundment and sequestration. Yes. Just all these DC insider terms that make people's eyes glaze over. But the fundamental core thing here is when Congress and the White House do a negotiation to pass a bill to spend money, Is that just a starting point for what the White House wants to do? Does the White House actually have the authority to just be like, no, we don't want to spend the money that we like legally agreed to do with Congress? And the Trump people are like, actually, this whole system, like this 1974 law that dictates when the president can and can't stop spending money that he agreed to spend with Congress, they just kind of want to throw that out. I mean, they want to challenge it legally, but they have also taken steps, according to most legal experts I've spoken to challenge it illegally. So that's, I think, like sort of the broad frame to understand the more sort of specific fights that have erupted over the last week, where the Trump White House came in and they said, okay, we're shutting down all funding on like woke stuff and DEI and like clean energy and all this stuff that they don't like. And like a lot of people were like, oh, that doesn't seem super legal. But they were like able to do it because it wasn't that much money, and they did EOs and you know, there
executive orders.
Yeah, right. Thank you. But then they discovered that, hey, actually there's like a lot of money going out the door that we don't want to go out the door for stuff like foreign aid and other things that they just, you know, the government is so big and there's so many agencies that they just didn't really feel like they had their head wrapped around all the money that was being spent. So they said, let's exempt Social Security, Medicare, and some other stuff, but like let's just like stop spending all the money and like wait and see what happens. But as they discovered, like a lot of people, including Republicans, have a lot of things that they depend on every day, like from the federal government. So it created this unbelievable crisis where, like, as you said, the Medicaid system shut down, like Head Start money shut down, like all these like vital functions, like all of a sudden froze up. And it was a total shock to the White House that had been expecting that they could just temporarily pause this money, not cancel it, just pause it while they figured out what money they wanted to potentially illegally cancel. But the fact that they were willing to just go there to say unilaterally, we're going to shut down all, not just some spending we don't like, but essentially all, you know, federal discretionary grant funding, which is, as you said, trillions of dollars, was a shocking assertion of unilateral control that, you know, is like potentially like king stuff, you know, like I don't want to be too like hyperbolic or dramatic here, but it's like, do we live in a country where the president can just say like the law that Congress passed is not something I want to follow? Like that is like what's at stake here. And the fact that they had to back down and say, actually, we don't want to stop all federal funds from going out is like a recognition that there are political constraints still in the White House, but it's not a recognition of the legal constraints.
Yeah, and this felt to me like the first big attempt to assert that level of authority. You know, we've been hearing during the campaign last year, people might have heard about Project 2025, and this is an idea that's been out there for a while. You know, regardless of this ultimately being pulled back on, this is something that they have talked about doing, and this maybe seemed like a little bit of a testing ground for it. Is that fair to say?
For sure. I mean, that's exactly what happened. I mean, I think they have been feeling really good, you know, like the vibes in DC, Liz could tell you too, like they've been feeling themselves. Like DC was a MAGA party, like club for like a week, you know, like from their perspective, the vibes have been immaculate. And so I think they felt like, will anyone really notice if we just pause funding for a little bit? And it's like, yeah, people do notice, like for sure. Like if people can't eat, they're going to like be complaining. So to me, like we're in the first inning here, or first two innings here, about this like huge question about whether the Trump sort of disregard for legal norms and procedures is going to be held in check for the next 4 years. There were guardrails that came off during Trump's first term, but like by and large, like the system held up. And I don't know, is that like going to happen this time? Like, so for instance, the order that the judge put into effect said basically like, don't pause this money. But my phone's been blowing up all week from people who, even after the judge's order, were saying like, we can't get our money. Is that just chaos? It's hard to tell from the outside, but it's the question like that I think hangs over Trump's second term writ large, like, which is like, what will he be far more unbound legally and constitutionally than he was last time? And a big part of that is going to be like, what happens with his nominations? What happens with Senate Republicans? And so how does that play out?
Yeah. Liz, Jeff mentioned the kind of response from congressional Republicans, and I wanted to ask you about that. I think it's fair to say that the guardrails are less in his second term than they were in the first term. There were Republicans that were more willing to push back on him during that term when the party wasn't kind of as magnified as it is now. There are a lot more Trump loyalists in Congress than there were back then. But this, in addition to the courts, how Republicans in Congress respond to these things is really significant because they have the majority of both chambers. They can seemingly say, look, this is money that our chamber authorized and was signed into law and needs to be spent. What did we see from them, both publicly and privately, in response to the freezing of this money?
Yeah, I think you can't really overstate how different the Republicans in Congress are this time than his first term. And part of that is just like the politics. When he won in 2016, he had underperformed almost every Senate Republican. Like he barely won, whereas they like really won their races. And this time around, it's the exact opposite. So the dynamic has just completely changed. They owe him. He doesn't owe them anything. And that's part of what you're seeing play out. I think what was so weird to see this week, usually, especially congressional leaders, they're sort of turfy. They protect their turf. They kind of roll their eyes at stuff that the White House wants that they don't understand, even if it's the president of their own party. Someone like Pelosi is going to tell Obama, no, it has to be this way, or this is how I'm doing it. There's just a long tradition of leaders just being kind of like having sort of swag and like protective
they want to
over
protect their institution. They want to protect their prerogatives. Yes.
And their power. They want to be in charge, right? And so Mike Johnson couldn't be more different from that. He owes his position entirely to Trump. He doesn't really have his own power base that's not Trump. And you see him, even just the fact that the leaders there are saying like, hey, should we do like one bill or two bills to pass tax cuts? Like they want Trump to dictate even just like congressional procedure type strategy questions is so weird. It's just not something I've seen or can think of back to a time where that's how things worked. And so then, that is less consequential. But then when you see something like Trump firing more than a dozen inspector generals that, go through agencies and try to root out fraud or abuse,
this is something that happened over the weekend, I believe.
Yeah, it was a Friday night kind of news dump situation. The pushback has been just absolutely nil. And that's another thing that, Jeff's talking about where there is a law, right? It says that they have to give them 30 days notice. They have to provide an explanation. There's no sort of public face of Republican opposition, at least the way there used to be. And it was in the background, they were yelling, and Republican pushback is part of why this memo got rescinded. But it was very muted in public, what they were saying. And a lot of them even just kind of walked the plank and said, no, it's great. Let's not have Meals on Wheels or whatever for a day on a memo that gets rescinded anyway.
Yeah, it's almost like he's just putting forward so many different things, and they already feel the need to really pick their battles to the extent that they want to. Jeff, I just wanted to briefly touch on another subject that I know you've been reporting on, and that's the Trump administration's directive that caused a lot of confusion and worry. It was about federal workers. Thousands of federal employees got an email this week with an offer that they could resign and be paid through September. Some people have been talking about this being a, quote, buyout. Jeff, what are the important details here, and what should we know about this?
This debate is about sort of what the federal civil service is going to look like. And the civil service, in terms of institutions that have checked Trump, that was a really important bulwark against some of his impulses in the first term. And Trump and Republicans and Elon Musk, the billionaire Trump advisor who spent over $270 million of his own personal wealth in the 2024 campaign, have been really pushing to gut the civil service, which they think is too expensive, although it's really a very small fraction of the overall federal budget. And they view that as sort of filled with liberals and sort of deeply antagonistic to their goals. Musk has said publicly that he wants a, quote, mass headcount reduction at the civil service. And so these things can be difficult to get done in practice, in part because there are outstanding negotiations contracts and union protections for these workers. So they seem to have figured, look, we've been denigrating the workers. We're asking them to do stuff that reverses decades of their work. Maybe we can get a lot more of them out the door if we offer them sort of a traditional buyout incentive package. I saw some back and forth about whether this is a buyout. I actually kind of come down on the side that it is. Musk, I think it's really interesting as someone who's been covering this quote unquote DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency idea since the summer. It originally started as a non-governmental entity that was supposed to exist outside of the government and give non-binding recommendations to the White House. That was the original conception as conceived sort of in the summer and fall.
Right. He's not a cabinet official who's being confirmed by the Senate or anything
and
like that.
And that made a good degree of sense because Musk is a billionaire who is never going to give up SpaceX and Tesla, et cetera, to like become a government worker who makes like $100K a year, right? However, Musk, I think it's been impressive in a way that he has figured out a way to work from within the government without surrendering any of his private financial conflicts. They basically had the DOGE take over the U.S. digital service, which was created to sort of be a strike force after the failure of the Obamacare website that didn't subject the tech people they wanted to bring in for that part of the government with all the onerous requirements that are typically expected of government workers. So they put DOGE there, and that's enabled Musk to really burrow into the government and try to not give recommendations from the outside, but to radically reshape the structure of the federal bureaucracy from within. And Musk and his people basically took over this obscure office called OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, which is kind of like the government's HR department. And this is some exclusive reporting we had this week, they kind of freelanced this whole thing kind of on their own. And it's reflective of Musk's attitude that we're just going to do it. If someone sues us, we'll deal with that later. I mean, this is like the kind of thing that like if Obama or Biden or even Bush had done it would be like a years-long process of reviews, like internal memos, like agency debates, like, you know, like this is something we would have been reporting on for like at a minimum months and months and months. And like within 2 weeks, the Musk people stood up this offer through OPM. The huge problem with this, beyond like not necessarily being legal, is that they don't really have the authority to authorize that spending. It's the agencies that pay federal workers. OPM is saying the agencies will give you this money through September, but they don't control what the agencies do. So it's asking federal officials to take a huge leap of faith in someone, you know, Trump and Musk, who haven't always like super held up their end of the bargain in every negotiation they've been on, to like put it mildly.
Yeah, it strikes me as something that is one of these stories that kind of gets lost in the shuffle because so many major things are happening, but we should expect to hear more about this moving forward. We're going to take a quick break there, and when we come back, we will walk through some of the key moments in the Senate confirmation hearings for 3 of Trump's controversial nominees. We'll be right back. Okay, guys, let's now turn to the 3 confirmation hearings that I've really been looking forward to watching and I monitored yesterday. On Thursday, we saw Trump's picks for FBI, Kash Patel, his pick for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his pick for Health and Human Services Secretary, all testify at the same time in front of relevant committees. Liz, let's start with Kash Patel. Can you just remind us who he is and why this is something of a dicey nomination that senators are currently considering?
So Kash Patel is the nominee to lead the FBI, and he has a record of public service that they're very much emphasizing now. He worked for the House Intelligence Committee under Devin Nunes, and he was a public defender, a prosecutor. But in recent years, he's really just been sort of a far-right pundit. He's written a book called Government Gangsters that called out members of what he calls the deep state for opposing Trump. He did a lot of appearances for Trump in his campaign. He's on a bunch of podcasts with some fringy people. And that's really what Democrats have been saying they're really concerned about, is that he would use the FBI to kind of go after some of these enemies of Trump's that he's also taken on as enemies, and that would lead to kind of a disastrous retribution situation.
Yeah, I think that the big concern with him is the idea that he would be involved in some kind of a retribution campaign. Were there moments from the hearing, Liz, that stood out to you on this front? Did Democrats successfully kind of press him on these things?
Yeah, I think that Democrats did hold up a lot of these statements and just basically say, did you say this? What did you mean by this? Which was a pretty effective way of just getting their concerns out about his temperament and character. Patel did a pretty good job of dodging it, though. I mean, he sort of had a technique of just saying everything is taken out of context.
Mhm.
So there was like no amount of text that a senator could read that he would say, okay, yeah, that's what I said. He would just say, no, that's out of context. That's out of context. So, close down the FBI and turn it into a museum. That's out of context. And then the senator would say, but like, this is the quote. This is what you said. I think he also did sort of proactively say things that were reassuring for some senators. He said that he didn't think it was a good idea to pardon anybody who had committed violence against law enforcement. So that's actually further
Which
than
Trump did recently.
Right. So, that's kind of an implicit critique of his January 6th blanket pardons, which was something that Pam Bondi, the attorney general nominee, wouldn't do in her hearing.
One of the other nominees on that front that I was really interested to watch this week, Liz, was Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence pick. She's a former Democratic member of Congress from Hawaii. She ran for president as a Democrat in 2020, but has since become kind of a MAGA star, I think it's safe to say. But she's known for a lot of controversial statements on Russia and Syria. Liz, can you run through what some of the big issues at this hearing were?
Yeah, so she faced two big issues at the hearing. One is her earlier criticism of a key surveillance program that the spy agencies use for intel, Section 702. She used to be a huge critic of that. During this process, she actually flipped on it and said, okay, I'm okay with it now. It's been changed, so it's less invasive. And she kind of like wavered under questioning under it. She just sounded like someone who didn't really like that program because she doesn't, and sort of struggled to keep to the new position of being in favor of it a little bit. But I would say the bigger issue from the hearing was that she was pressed repeatedly by Republican senators to say that Edward Snowden is a traitor for leaking information on intelligence gathering.
Yeah, this was from Senators James Lankford of Oklahoma, a Republican, Senator Todd Young of Indiana, who's also a Republican. Let's play the clip of Lankford.
Was Edward Snowden a traitor?
Senator, my heart is with my commitment to our Constitution and our nation's security.
Ours too.
Thank you. Yeah. I have shown throughout my almost 22 years of service in the military, as well as my time in Congress, how seriously I take the privilege of having access to classified information and our nation's secrets.
Yeah, so she repeatedly didn't really answer that question, even when Republicans asked her. Were you surprised by how Republicans questioned her in this hearing, and how much does this suggest about their calculus in actually voting for her?
Yeah, I would say she's the only Trump nominee who's faced consistently tough questions in her hearing from more than one Republican. I think RFK got some tough questions from a Republican Senator, Bill Cassidy, but that was about it. This was the first time you saw someone just kind of getting hammered by senators of Trump's own party. And I think that doesn't mean they're a no, but it just shows how much concern there is there. And she's just clearly the most endangered nominee at this point.
Yeah, Liz, you mentioned Robert F. Kennedy Jr. hearing, the nominee for Health and Human Services Secretary. He testified on Wednesday to the Senate Finance Committee, then on Thursday to the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. That first committee is the one that's actually going to vote on him. There's actually one senator who is key here who serves on both committees, and his questions both days seem to trip up Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana. On Wednesday, he asked some detailed questions about Medicaid that Kennedy didn't really seem to understand the program fully. And then on Thursday, we saw some really interesting back and forth between the two of them about Kennedy's longstanding links of vaccines to autism, which the science suggests are baseless. Liz, can you talk about how Kennedy handled this question, which he had to know was going to be coming?
Yeah, I thought that Kennedy's response on the vaccine autism one, for someone who's been pushing that link so hard, I think it was a pretty major retreat. Like he was sort of saying, he was opening up the possibility that there could be evidence that this doesn't there's no link, and that if there was that evidence, he would apologize. And he wasn't.
Yeah, I was struck by that. He said that if you show me the data, and I'm convinced, I'll apologize for misleading people or something to that effect.
Yeah, like he was at least open to this idea, I guess, when he's sort of like a major champion of that link. But it clearly wasn't enough for Cassidy. It wasn't what he wanted to hear. He wanted to hear him say, there's not enough evidence for me to make this claim, and I shouldn't be making this claim. And that's not what he heard. And, in his closing statement, he essentially said, I'm struggling with this, which I thought was very kind of transparent. He was just like, I don't really know what to do because I have a lot of concerns with you and your answers.
Liz, can you just talk about how likely you think it is that these nominees are actually going to advance to the full Senate and be confirmed?
It's just really hard to say. I feel like the lesson for me of the past 8 years has been to not make predictions. I mean, it also really depends on with Hegseth, there was such a strong outside campaign that built around him, blessed by Trump, but not at all led by Trump, to say, put the smack down on Joni Ernst and other senators who had popped their heads up. I have not seen that activate around Tulsi Gabbard. I think she's a little bit of a weak nominee just in that political sense, because she is kind of a Democrat. And even though she's a former Democrat, and even though there's a lot of MAGA affection for her, it's just not the same, where Hegseth was really one of their own. He was a Fox News guy. The idea of tanking him over the personal scandals or judgment questions is just a bigger bridge to cross. Whereas a lot of these people just don't really know Gabbard or feel any kind of affinity for her, I think, in the same way. So I still think she's the most in trouble, and, just one Republican senator would tank her in the committee vote.
Certainly some very interesting things to be watching, and we'll keep an eye on them on this show. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Jeff and Liz.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Liz Goodwin covers Congress for The Post, and Jeff Stein is a White House economics reporter. If you're tuning in via the Campaign Moment show feed, make sure to go follow Post Reports and The Seven for even more politics coverage throughout the week. Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Rachel Van Dongen. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, Elahe Izadi, and Martine Powers. I'm Aaron Blake. Have a great weekend.